Chatterley Lane had never been the sort of street to attract notice beyond the occasional buyer of antique teapots or a wandering cat, and on that particularly mild Thursday morning it remained as unremarkable as ever. A faint haze of smoke rose from Mrs. Weatherby's chimney, and the subtle clatter of horse hooves against cobbles could just be heard over the soft hiss of the early tram. The Lane's residents, most of whom had lived there long enough to feel faintly affronted by the very notion of novelty, were engaged in their usual routines, Miss Blenkinsop sweeping her front steps with the solemnity of a coronation, Mr. Tilling adjusting the wrought-iron sign above his locksmith's shop, and a stray tabby weaving between the legs of pedestrians in a thoroughly disdainful manner. It was, in short, the kind of morning where nothing whatsoever should have happened. And yet, as Inspector Purbright would later reflect in the privacy of his tidy office, that was precisely the moment when the unusual slipped quietly into the ordinary, like smoke through a keyhole. The incident itself began somewhat inconspicuously at the small antiques shop run by Mr. Harold Finch. He was a man of modest height and meticulous habits, with an expression that suggested perpetual astonishment at the conduct of others. On that day, Finch was arranging a display of silver candlesticks, a set that had been in his family for 3 generations, when a customer of particularly brisk gait appeared at the door. "Morning," said the customer, a man in a tweed jacket and spectacles that slid perilously down his nose. He gave Finch a curt nod and, without a greeting of any sort, leaned over the counter to whisper, "I hear you've got things for sale that the public shouldn't see." Finch, startled by the unaccustomed familiarity, blinked several times. "I beg your pardon?" The man tapped the counter lightly as if the sound itself carried weight. "Secrets. Pieces of people's pasts, if you like. Rumours that are more valuable than silver." Finch swallowed, more out of habit than fear. "I'm afraid this is a shop for antiques, not gossip," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Yet as he spoke, he noticed something odd. The man's eyes flicked to a small envelope lying innocuously among the candlesticks. Before Finch could intervene, the man extracted it, glanced around the shop with the air of a conspirator, and tucked it under his coat. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and departed into the lane, leaving a faint scent of tobacco and something harsher, a trace of cologne that suggested both wealth and self-importance. It was only a minute later that Mrs. Weatherby appeared at Finch's door, carrying a basket of laundry and a look of mild indignation. "Did you see that man?" she asked, frowning at the empty doorway. "The one in tweed. He's been lurking about since yesterday, I think, and now he's gone off with whatever that was." Finch, flustered and inwardly chastened for not having prevented the theft, nodded. Yes, he seemed interested in some private matters. Mrs. Weatherby pursed her lips. "Private matters? In this lane? My goodness, Harold, I hope it's nothing scandalous. You know how people gossip, and gossip it did. By lunchtime, the street had been thoroughly infiltrated by a current of mild panic, curiosity and conjecture. Mr. Tilling, ever vigilant for improprieties, had informed anyone who would listen, including the postman and the milkman, that there was something amiss in Finch's shop, and he had framed it as though Chatterley Lane itself were under siege. Miss Blenkinsop, who rarely engaged in anything beyond sweeping and glaring at errant cats, had contributed her own theory. The envelope, she decided, must contain love letters or blackmail. The tabby, whose opinion went largely unrecorded but was often audible in muffled hisses, had chosen to observe from the rooftops, apparently judging the humans harshly. It was in this quietly combustible atmosphere that Inspector Purbright arrived at Chatterley Lane. He had been summoned, not by urgency, but by a polite note left by Mr. Finch the previous evening, mentioning a curious disturbance that seemed worthy of attention. Purbright, who believed in attending to small irregularities before they escalated into crises, had taken the tram at a leisurely pace, enjoying the unusual prospect of a day devoted entirely to observation. He noted with the sort of understated satisfaction that often marked his visits, that the Lane's residents had almost immediately begun to reveal themselves in ways that might prove useful. Mr. Tilling was puffing with indignation. Miss Blenkinsop was busy forming a critical barricade of brooms at her doorway, and Mrs. Weatherby was gossiping with the tenacity of someone who believed the moral order of the street required constant vigilance. Purbright's own approach was quiet, polite, and deliberate. He nodded to Mr. Finch, inspected the display of candlesticks with a practised eye, and remarked on the absence of the envelope with an air of mild curiosity rather than reproach. "A tidy little shop," he said, choosing words that conveyed interest without presumption. "And yet, I hear there has been some excitement this morning." Finch, who had been rehearsing a story to justify the man in tweed's sudden audacity, relaxed slightly. "Well, yes, Inspector. It's nothing criminal, I suppose, but a bit odd. Some gentleman came in and, well, he took an envelope that perhaps should not have been so easily accessible." Purbright inclined his head. "Ah, easily overlooked, yet often such small things can set more substantial events in motion." Finch blinked. "Yes, Inspector, quite." The inspector's gaze swept the lane, noting the residents' discreet eavesdropping and the subtle alterations in their posture and expression. The street was calm, almost serene, but, as Purbright knew, serenity in a small town was often only the surface tension above a complex web of motivations, grudges and curiosities. As he left the shop to continue his inspection, he passed Mrs. Weatherby and observed the delicate frown she bestowed upon the tabby perched above her doorway. "I do hope," she murmured, "that the lane will return to normal soon." Purbright smiled faintly, inwardly, at the notion of normal in Chatterley Lane. He suspected that normalcy, once disturbed, might never be entirely regained, and that the envelope, now in unknown hands, was the first ripple in a pond whose surface would soon shimmer with secrets long concealed. He walked on, making mental notes, aware that in a town such as this, the smallest act, an absent envelope, a whispered remark, a glance held a moment too long, could be as revealing as a confession. And, as always, the quiet, almost imperceptible rhythms of the lane would provide the clues. It was only a matter of time, observation, and patience to discern which truths were for sale and which were merely borrowed. By mid-morning, the mild stir in Chatterley Lane had grown into a discreet, yet unmistakable, commotion. Mrs. Weatherby had recruited several neighbours to her parlour for what she called an urgent conference, a gathering more properly described as the polite dissemination of conjecture. The aroma of oversteeped tea and recently baked scones seemed almost deliberately designed to soften the sharp edges of gossip, and the participants leaned in to share observations that were, in varying degrees, fact, suspicion, and imagination. "It must have been important," Mrs. Weatherby said, tapping a finger against the rim of her teacup. "A man taking something from Harold Finch's shop without payment. Why, it's positively brazen." Miss Blenkinsop, who had arrived carrying a notebook she had recently begun to treat as a ledger of local misdeeds, added, "I noticed he glanced several times at the blinds. Perhaps he was being watched." She pronounced the last two words with particular gravity, as if the very act of surveillance were a common occurrence on Chatterley Lane. Mr. Tilling, ever ready to elevate minor disturbances to matters of civic concern, contributed his own assessment. If the envelope contained sensitive information, it could upset the balance of property negotiations in the East Quarter, he said, speaking more from habit than knowledge, but with an air that suggested inside intelligence. Across the lane, the tabby had descended from its rooftop observation post and now prowled the edges of the gathering, weaving invisibly among the skirts and shoes. It was, perhaps, the only member of the street entirely uninterested in the envelope, and it carried itself with the air of a critic, unimpressed by the residents' fuss. Inspector Purbright arrived shortly thereafter, his pace deliberate, his hands clasped behind his back. He paused just long enough to nod politely to each participant before taking a discreet position near the window, from which he could observe the ebb and flow of conversation. It was, he noted, precisely the sort of situation in which the truth tended to reveal itself. In small gestures, in the careful selection of words, in what people left unsaid. "Good morning," Purbright said softly, allowing his presence to register without intruding. "I understand there has been a minor disturbance." Mrs. Weatherby's eyes widened, and she clutched her teacup as though it were a talisman. "Inspector!" "Indeed, it's been most alarming. That man, he took an envelope from Mr. Finch's shop. Without payment." "An envelope, you say?" Purbright inquired, his tone neutral, but his eyes, so often described as quietly calculating, surveyed the faces before him. "Yes," said Finch, who had just arrived, slightly flustered. "It was left out on the counter. I thought it unremarkable at the time, simply mislaid paperwork perhaps, but now—" He trailed off, as though the implications of the theft were too complex for immediate articulation. The inspector listened, making no immediate judgment, his gaze flicking from one speaker to another. Each offered a slightly different version of events, highlighting the peculiarities most relevant to their own experience. The frequency of the man's glances, the swiftness of his hands, the unusual weight of the envelope. It was all fragmentary yet, Purbright knew, sufficiently precise for him to begin constructing a mental map of motive and opportunity. Miss Blenkinsop leaned forward, whispering to Mrs. Weatherby in what she considered a confidential aside. "I dare say he had an accomplice. There is often more than one hand in matters of secrecy." Purbright noted the remark with mild amusement. She spoke with the authority of someone convinced that life was a series of deliberate plots, and while he allowed her statement to settle, he made a mental note to verify the possibility, however remote, of collaboration. Meanwhile, the lane itself was coming alive with its own commentary. Neighbours leaned from windows, exchanged quiet remarks at doorsteps, and glanced furtively at the shop. Every gesture, no matter how insignificant, became part of the collective narrative, and Purbright observed these subtleties with patience. The man in tweed, if he lingered at all in the town, had left ripples that would, over hours, develop into currents. By mid-afternoon, Finch had recounted once more the circumstances of the encounter, adding details he had initially overlooked: the distinct fragrance, the precise angle at which the man had held the envelope, the peculiar twitch in his left eyebrow. Purbright received these observations with the customary quiet appreciation, recognizing that trifles often contained far more than their apparent insignificance. At the same time, Purbright allowed other residents to provide context. Mr. Tilling supplied an account of a similar, though minor, incident months prior, which he attributed to an itinerant peddler, while Mrs. Weatherby emphasized the lane's vulnerability to disruption, citing an old story of a misplaced ledger that had once nearly ruined the local bookshop. The connections were, superficially, tenuous. Nevertheless, Purbright was not inattentive. As evening approached, the lane returned to a semblance of calm. The scones had been consumed, the tea was cold, and the tabby had resumed its rooftop post. The residents had dispersed, taking with them fragments of speculation and hints of suspicion. Only Purbright remained, noting the absence of immediate resolution as both a challenge and an opportunity. He paused by Finch's shop one last time before departing, offering a polite, reflective comment. "One finds, Mr. Finch, that what seems trivial to some may be instructive to others." Finch inclined his head, uncertain whether he had been complimented or subtly warned. Purbright walked on, aware that in Chatterley Lane the smallest act, a glance, a comment, a gesture, could possess disproportionate significance. He was convinced that before the day ended, those minor elements would begin to align, revealing intentions and secrets not yet imagined by any of the lane's inhabitants, and he was content to wait patiently for the first of these truths to surface. The following morning, Inspector Purbright took a deliberate stroll through Chatterley Lane, observing the subtle shifts in behaviour that had emerged overnight. The lane itself seemed unchanged, yet the air carried a faint tension, almost imperceptible, like a thread stretched too tightly. Shop windows reflected polite smiles and nods, but the gestures were slightly rehearsed, as if the residents were practicing normality while each wondered what the others might know. Mr. Finch, upon seeing Purbright approach, gave a curt nod.
"Good morning, Inspector."
"I hope you slept well." "Quite well, thank you," Purbright replied, his eyes scanning the shop and the street beyond.
"I trust the envelope incident has not caused too much consternation." Finch hesitated.
"There is
Speculation, naturally.
People are curious," Purbright inclined his head subtly.
Curiosity can be instructive, Mr. Finch, if it is observed carefully. With that, he began his private inquiries, starting at the bookshop opposite Finch's. Mr. Dalloway, the proprietor, was a small, wiry man with the air of someone who had memorized every detail of the lane. He spoke readily, though cautiously, detailing an encounter with a man in tweed the previous day, who had lingered near the window, seemingly reading the titles, but glancing often toward Finch's shop. Purbright noted the precise wording, the hesitations, and the slight shrug of the shoulders that suggested unease more than deceit. He asked a few polite follow-ups, careful to avoid leading questions, and left with a mental note. The man's interest was selective, but his timing was deliberate. At the bakery, Mrs. Crummett spoke of seeing the same man pause mid-lane, bending slightly as though to tie his shoelace, yet taking care to scan the windows.
"Odd, isn't it?"
she said, tapping the counter. "I would not have noticed it, but my Tom always points things out. He says a man who watches like that is planning something." Purbright accepted the comment with quiet acknowledgement. Observing children, pets, and idle gestures often yielded as much insight as formal statements. He left the bakery with the faint aroma of warm bread and the impression of an orchestrated performance by someone careful to remain unnoticed. Returning to Finch's shop, Purbright lingered in conversation, noting the shopkeeper's peculiar attention to the display of candlesticks, the exact alignment of small porcelain figures, and the envelope's absence. "Do you mind if I examine the counter more closely?" he asked, and Finch consented, grateful for the inspector's tact. Purbright's scrutiny revealed a slight indentation in the wooden surface, as though an envelope had been pressed against it with care. It was a trivial mark, yet it spoke volumes. The man in tweed had handled the object deliberately, not hastily, and had been aware of its presence. Meanwhile, the lane's residents continued their silent surveillance. Miss Blenkinsop's notebook, propped against her windowsill, recorded arrivals and departures with fastidious precision. Mr. Tilling, adjusting his sign again, cast frequent glances toward Finch's door. Mrs. Weatherby, busy with her laundry, paused to mutter observations to anyone within earshot. Purbright, patient as always, allowed these fragments of behavior to accumulate, understanding that patterns often revealed themselves more clearly than any single statement. By late morning, a subtle anomaly appeared, a small scrap of paper, partially tucked beneath Finch's doorstep, bearing a hastily scrawled note. It read, in irregular handwriting, a mere phrase, "Not all that glitters is to be sold." Purbright pocketed the note, noting the peculiar mixture of caution and provocation. Such a detail, he understood, was seldom meaningless. In the afternoon he ventured further, speaking with a few householders whose windows overlooked the lane. Each added nuance, the distant click of boots, the muted clearing of throats, a voice that sounded concerned but was never fully heard. None had seen the man again, yet all were alert to his possible return. Purbright reflected quietly, as he often did during these early phases, that in small towns, secrets were rarely buried. They were only disguised by routine, politeness, and the careful management of appearances. The envelope, the man in tweed, and the enigmatic note were all part of a delicate social puzzle, one whose edges were perceptible only to those willing to watch and wait. As evening approached, the lane returned to its familiar rhythm, faint smoke from chimneys, the tabby curling atop a wall, and the gentle shuffle of pedestrians. Yet Purbright remained convinced that beneath this superficial calm, the day's events had set forces in motion whose consequences would ripple through Chatterley Lane. The subtle interplay of observation, motive and opportunity would, he knew, eventually point toward a conclusion that no casual glance could foresee. By the following morning, Chatterley Lane had assumed a curious, almost expectant hush, as though the very cobbles themselves were holding their breath. The lane's residents moved with heightened awareness, each footstep and glance now measured, their routines subtly altered by the preceding day's incidents. Even the tabby seemed more vigilant, pausing mid-stride to watch an unremarkable pigeon flutter across a roof. Inspector Purbright arrived at Finch's shop with deliberate calm, noting the soft murmur of conversations behind closed curtains and the polite yet inquisitive stares of passers-by. Finch, predictably anxious, greeted him at the door. "Inspector, good morning. I've hardly slept." Thinking of that envelope, Purbright inclined his head slightly. "One finds, Mr. Finch, that sleep is often disturbed when something unusual occurs, especially when the object of concern is both valuable and elusive." Finch's hands trembled faintly as he arranged a small display of silver trinkets, and Purbright's eyes caught the subtle distraction, one candlestick slightly askew, a detail hardly noticeable to anyone else, yet remarkably revealing to an observer who cared for minutiae. The inspector began his quiet inquiries, visiting the households bordering the lane. At Mrs. Weatherby's, he found her fretting over a minor discrepancy in her accounts, which she attributed, rather insistently, to the unsettling presence of outsiders and the envelope's mysterious theft.
"It may sound trivial, Inspector," she said, pressing a lace handkerchief to her lips, "but I cannot help thinking someone might use such matters to gain advantage."
Purbright nodded, acknowledging the underlying truth she had unwittingly expressed. Influence in small towns often operated through the most innocuous channels: overheard remarks, forgotten ledgers, or the strategic absence of attention. Further along, Mr. Tilling recounted a brief encounter with a stranger in tweed on the previous evening, noting that the man had paused to examine a lamppost as if hiding something beneath its shadow. Tilling's voice carried the unintentional weight of suspicion, revealing both the teller and the observed in equal measure. Purbright committed every nuance to memory, understanding that the gaps between facts often contained the richest insight at the bookshop. Mr. Dalloway supplied an additional observation, a note of excitement in the man's voice, subtly restrained, as if he were performing a careful balancing act between curiosity and self-interest. "He was very deliberate," Dalloway said, tapping his spectacles with a forefinger.
"Not careless, Inspector."
"That, I think, is the oddest part." Returning to Finch's, Purbright examined the shop more closely, noting dust displaced in improbable patterns on the counter and floor. One corner of the carpet, faintly folded, suggested a hurried movement, or perhaps an attempt to obscure a footprint. Every minor imperfection seemed intentional, yet left no immediate accusation. It was the sort of detail that invited reflection rather than judgment. As the morning advanced, Purbright allowed himself a slow walk along the lane, observing interactions with careful neutrality. Miss Blenkinsop had resumed her notebook duties at the window, recording arrivals, departures, and the odd flutter of a curtain, while Mrs. Weatherby whispered warnings to any neighbour willing to listen. Even the local postman seemed unusually conscious of the lane's rhythm, adjusting his gait and scanning each doorway with practiced vigilance. The inspector paused by a small alleyway where a scrap of paper, caught by the morning breeze, had drifted across the cobbles. It bore a hastily written word, "Observe." The note was trivial, yet its placement suggested intention, a subtle provocation or guidance meant for someone specific. Purbright pocketed it, the faint smile on his face betraying amusement at the game a clever hand was playing. By late afternoon, Finch had managed a brief reprieve from worry, distracted by the delivery of an old clock mechanism and the intricacies of its repair. Purbright, observing the shopkeeper's renewed focus, reflected on the odd interplay of anxiety and routine in the lane. Small towns, he thought, were seldom disturbed by grand events. Rather, they trembled in response to the subtle manipulation of expectation, curiosity, and fear. Evening descended with its usual civility. Street lamps flickered to life. The lane's shadows stretched into quiet angles, and the tabby resumed its perambulations along the roofline. Purbright lingered a moment, noting that the day's observations, trifling as they appeared, were assembling into a pattern. Each glance, whispered remark, and displaced object contributed to a mosaic that, in time, would reveal both intent and identity. He departed with the soft click of his boots fading down the lane, content that patience, observation, and an unhurried approach would eventually yield clarity. In Chatterley Lane, as always, the smallest clues carried the largest significance, and the envelope's theft, minor though it seemed, promised to uncover secrets carefully concealed beneath the surface of civility. It was mid-morning when the first, truly peculiar detail presented itself, so trivial that most observers might have overlooked it entirely. Inspector Purbright, walking along Chatterley Lane with his habitual measured pace, noticed a single silver teaspoon lying near the curb outside Finch's shop. Its presence was incongruous, polished, without a trace of dirt, and yet clearly displaced from its usual domestic context. He bent to examine it, noting the faint imprint of initials on the handle, HF, and concluded that it had belonged to Finch's own collection. The discovery in itself seemed inconsequential, yet Purbright's experience told him otherwise. In small towns, it was rarely the grand gestures that betrayed motive or identity. It was the subtle disruption of routine, the overlooked anomaly, that spoke most clearly. The spoon might have been dropped carelessly, or perhaps left deliberately as a message, an understated signal of observation, intrusion, or both. Finch arrived shortly thereafter, slightly flustered, and cast a nervous eye at the spoon.
Inspector, I owe that.
It must have fallen from the counter yesterday, though I cannot imagine how. Everything was arranged precisely. Purbright observed his hesitation, the faint tightening of his mouth, and the careful avoidance of direct eye contact.
Indeed, he said quietly.
It is remarkable how the smallest object can draw attention to otherwise unnoticed details. As he pocketed the spoon for closer inspection, Purbright noted the reactions of others in the lane. Mrs. Weatherby peered from her window, lips pursed, as though the spoon were a token of some grand conspiracy, while Miss Blenkinsop, notebook at the ready, recorded its existence with meticulous precision. The tabby, disdainfully indifferent, flicked its tail and leapt gracefully onto a low wall. Resuming its silent survey, Purbright then continued his discreet inquiries, speaking with several residents whose houses overlooked the lane. Each offered minor yet oddly revealing observations. A window left slightly ajar, a shadow that lingered too long, a gate that squeaked at an unusual pitch. All were fragments, trivial in isolation, but collectively forming a subtle map of presence, movement, and attention. Mr. Tilling contributed an account of a stranger in tweed observed loitering the previous evening. He paused by the lamp-post, Tilling said, adjusting his spectacles, and appeared to peer beneath the base, though I cannot say what he expected to find.
Odd, Inspector, quite odd. Purbright noted the alignment of these minor events. The envelope taken from Finch's shop, the scrap of paper advising vigilance, and now the teaspoon.
They all suggested a careful intruder, one who left traces designed to be noticed, yet not overtly incriminating. The thought of deliberate misdirection entertained him, for it implied a subtle intelligence at work. more interesting than a mere opportunistic theft. Later, he paused outside the bakery, where Mrs. Crummett mentioned a deliveryman who had arrived unusually early, yet left without explanation. "I didn't think much of it," she said, dabbing her floury hands on a cloth. But he seemed to glance toward Finch's shop more than the bread. Curious, isn't it? Purbright allowed himself a small nod of acknowledgement, considering how the simplest movement, a glance, a pause, a hand lingering near an object, could convey intention without a word being spoken. In towns such as Chatterley Lane, behaviour was as revealing as any confession, and often far more difficult to fabricate convincingly. By late afternoon, Purbright returned to Finch's shop to re-examine the counter, aligning it with the various anomalies noted over the day. The spoon's imprint, the faint indentation where the envelope had rested, the scattered dust on the polished surface, all converged into a subtle narrative. The intruder had been deliberate, careful, and observant, leaving behind clues that were more message than mistake. As evening fell, the lane resumed its ordinary rhythm. Residents returned to domestic routines. The tabby prowled the rooftops, and the soft glow of lamps cast gentle shadows along the cobbles. Yet Purbright remained convinced that beneath the apparent calm, an invisible tension persisted, the sum of observation, curiosity, and concealed intent. The small details, seemingly trivial, were accumulating with quiet insistence, and he understood that they would, in time, reveal the identity and purpose of the unseen hand that had begun to manipulate the order of Chatterley Lane. The next morning, Chatterley Lane revealed yet another layer of subtle disruption. Inspector Purbright, as ever, arrived without haste, noting the familiar rhythm of the street, the gentle clatter of Miss Blenkinsop's broom, the occasional creak of Mr. Tilling's sign, and the faint murmur of conversations carried through open windows. Yet beneath this apparent normality, he sensed the undercurrent of unease growing, as if the lane itself had begun to watch and whisper in concert with its inhabitants. At Finch's shop, the silver candlesticks remained neatly aligned, but Finch himself was noticeably anxious, fussing with the counter and glancing repeatedly toward the doorway. "Inspector," he began, his voice low, "I've found another small item out of place, an old key, I believe, from one of the display cabinets. I cannot account for how it got there." Purbright accepted the key with his customary patience, examining it for any subtle indication of use or purpose. It was unremarkable in form, yet the presence of this new anomaly suggested a continuity of intention, a quiet orchestration rather than simple carelessness. The thought intrigued him. The intruder was not merely taking or observing, but deliberately leaving traces, small markers that might test attention or convey a message only the perceptive could interpret. He continued his inquiries along the lane, speaking to residents who had, by now, developed an almost conspiratorial awareness of the unfolding events. Mrs. Weatherby, clutching a handkerchief with the morning's flower dust, spoke of seeing a shadow pass the shop window late the previous evening, quick and deliberate, vanishing before anyone could approach. Mr. Tilling contributed the observation of an unfamiliar carriage idling briefly in the square, then moving off silently, a detail that, while minor, added to the mosaic of surveillance and subtle intrusion. Miss Blenkinsop, notebook open at her usual vantage, had recorded precise timings of movements across the lane, the pause at Finch's doorway, the glancing from curtains, the soft footsteps near alleyways. Each entry, though ostensibly trivial, allowed Purbright to map the invisible choreography that governed the day's occurrences. Returning to Finch's, he noted the placement of the key alongside the prior anomalies, the missing envelope, the misplaced teaspoon, the scrap of paper bearing a cryptic admonition. Each element, when considered collectively, suggested more than coincidence. It hinted at deliberate attention, at a hand shaping the lane's perceptions and eliciting responses. However unconscious from its residents, by afternoon, A new voice entered the quietly conspiratorial mix. Mrs. Crabtree. The grocer mentioned a customer she had not seen before, a man who lingered near the corner of the lane and seemed unusually interested in Finch's shop. He spoke to no one, she noted, but I saw him glance toward the window more than once. Not a thief, perhaps, but certainly someone observing. Purbright absorbed this information with his habitual equanimity, considering motive, opportunity, and the subtle interplay of attention and behavior. In small towns, he reflected, observation itself could be as revealing as action. Those who watched carefully often revealed their intentions in gestures so minor as to escape casual notice. Late in the day, he paused near the alleyway where the scrap of paper had previously appeared. A faint footprint, half obscured by a loose cobblestone, suggested recent passage. Purbright crouched, noting its size and angle, the subtle scuff along the heel, and the implication of measured, careful movement. It confirmed what he had suspected. The intruder was meticulous, deliberate, and, in a curious sense, enjoying the game of being observed while remaining unseen. As evening descended, Chatterley Lane resumed the semblance of routine, though its rhythm was altered ever so slightly. The tabby prowled with its usual disdain, shadows lengthened under the street lamps, and the residents retreated indoors, whispering speculations to one another and to themselves. Purbright walked the length of the lane slowly, absorbing the quiet resonance of events, the layering of anomalies and observations. He understood that the seemingly minor details, the envelope, the spoon, the key, the cryptic scrap, the passing carriage, were elements of a deliberate pattern. With patience as his guide, he reflected that in Chatterley Lane, the smallest gestures often carried the heaviest significance. The intruder, whoever he or she might be, had begun to reveal character through the art of subtlety, inviting observation, teasing discovery, and Purbright, as ever, was content to follow the evidence quietly, certain that the lane itself would continue to supply both clues and contradictions until the moment of revelation arrived. The morning sun caught the dampness of Chatterley Lane with a gentle glow, illuminating small irregularities that had gone unnoticed in the previous days. Inspector Purbright, strolling at his accustomed unhurried pace, observed the lane's familiar faces with the quiet interest of a man attuned to subtle shifts in routine and expression. The residents, for their part, exhibited a mixture of curiosity and unease, each attempting to maintain ordinary appearances while navigating the persistent disturbance of recent events. At Finch's shop, the counter had been reorganized, though traces of prior disorder remained faintly visible. Finch himself seemed restless, fussing with arrangements and muttering under his breath. "Inspector, I cannot explain it," he said, indicating the polished candlesticks. "Another item has gone missing, a small brooch from the display case. I left it there this morning." Purbright regarded the empty space with mild interest. The removal was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it carried the same deliberate quality as the previous anomalies: the envelope, the teaspoon, the key. Each act suggested attention, calculation, and an intent to provoke observation without overt disruption. He ventured along the lane, conversing quietly with residents whose windows overlooked the shop. Miss Blenkinsop recorded yet another series of arrivals and departures with meticulous care, noting pauses, glances, and footsteps that seemed to echo with purpose. Mr. Tilling added his observation of a brief figure loitering near the alleyway, moving with an economy of motion that suggested familiarity with the lane. Mrs. Weatherby, leaning from her doorway, commented on the unusual synchrony of movements across the street, speculating on motives with her customary emphasis on social propriety. Purbright allowed these observations to settle, careful not to impose interpretation prematurely. He noted the subtle nervousness in Finch's manner, the slightly forced attention of his neighbours, and the air of anticipation that seemed to have settled over the lane. Each fragment of behaviour reinforced a pattern he had begun to discern. The intruder acted with precision, leaving small, deliberate traces, each intended to test perception and provoke response. A peculiar detail presented itself at mid-morning, a faint, almost imperceptible smudge on the edge of Finch's counter. Purbright examined it, noting the angle and pressure of the mark. It suggested contact by gloved fingers, deliberate and controlled, yet indicative of someone accustomed to handling small objects without leaving obvious evidence. The subtlety pleased him. It confirmed the intruder's careful attention to concealment while revealing just enough to entice observation. Further inquiries led him to Mrs. Crabtree, the grocer, who recalled a man in tweed pausing at the corner of the lane, surveying the shop fronts with apparent casualness. He lingered just long enough, she said, to make one wonder whether he was curious or looking for something specific. Purbright noted her phrasing and the faint tension in her voice. Observation in Chatterley Lane, he reflected, often revealed as much about the observer as the observed. By afternoon, the pattern of anomalies had expanded. The envelope, the teaspoon, the key, the scrap of paper, and now the brooch. Each item, removed or displaced, was trivial in isolation, but cumulatively created a narrative of deliberate interference, subtle testing, and concealed intent. Purbright considered the timing, spacing, and nature of the disturbances. They suggested intelligence, patience, and a measure of amusement at the reactions provoked in the lane's residents. Evening brought with it the usual softening of activity. Shadows stretched along the cobbles, the tabby prowled the rooftops with its customary disdain, and the street lamps cast pools of muted light. Residents withdrew indoors, carrying with them fragments of speculation and unease, whispering about the succession of small disturbances with polite horror. Purbright remained, walking slowly along the lane, reflecting on the subtle choreography of events. The intruder's behavior demonstrated a keen understanding of small-town psychology, how attention could be manipulated, how gossip could amplify, and how minor disruptions could unsettle the veneer of normality. Each detail, however slight, was a deliberate stroke in a quiet game of influence and observation. He concluded his round with the familiar satisfaction of a man confident in the accumulation of evidence, however fragmented it might appear. In Chatterley Lane, he thought, the smallest gestures often carried the greatest significance, and the sequence of seemingly trivial incidents was steadily revealing the character and intent of the unseen hand at work. Patience, careful observation, and subtle inference would, as always, yield the answers in due course. The morning air carried a faint chill as Inspector Purbright made his customary walk along Chatterley Lane, noting the usual rhythm of domestic life underlaid with a subtle tension that had been building over the past week. The lane appeared ordinary, Miss Blenkinsop sweeping with meticulous precision, Mr. Tilling adjusting his sign, and Mrs. Weatherby arranging her flower pots with quiet vigilance. Yet the incidents, the envelope, the teaspoon, the key, the scrap of paper, the brooch had created a faint, almost imperceptible disquiet among the residents, each responding in ways that revealed more than they intended. Purbright began his inquiries at Finch's shop, where the shopkeeper was inspecting the display cases with heightened attention. "Inspector," Finch said softly, "I found another item misplaced this morning, a small carved box I keep for letters. It's not missing, just slightly shifted, though I am certain I placed it differently." Purbright examined the box carefully, noting the direction of its tilt and the faint scratch along its base. Small, deliberate gestures, he thought, often spoke louder than any confession. The intruder was methodical, leaving behind minor clues that invited scrutiny without revealing motive. He moved along the lane, speaking quietly with residents whose windows afforded a view of the shop. Mrs. Weatherby mentioned a shadow passing in the early hours, quick and controlled, while Miss Blenkinsop's notebook contained precise timings of movements near Finch's door. Mr. Tilling added that a figure had been seen near the square earlier, observing the lane with deliberate detachment. Each account, fragmentary as it was, contributed to a growing understanding of behavior, pattern, and intention. Purbright paused at the corner where the previous scrap of paper had been found. The cobbles were undisturbed, but a faint smudge suggested recent passage. He crouched briefly to examine it, noting the subtle pressure marks and the implied direction of movement. Observation, he reflected, often revealed more about character than words could convey. Later, he visited the grocer, Mrs. Crabtree, who reported that the same man in tweed had been seen again, though fleetingly, near the lane. "He did not enter my shop," she said, "but he lingered just long enough to make me uneasy." Purbright's mind noted the precision of timing, the deliberate restraint, and the apparent amusement in testing the lane's attention. By mid-afternoon, he had retraced the day's minor anomalies, the displaced box, the faint smudge, the pattern of observation reported by residents, and began to discern a strategy in the intruder's behavior. Each act was small, almost trivial, yet collectively they created a web of influence, testing responses, provoking curiosity, and revealing human tendencies under subtle pressure. As evening descended, the lane resumed its surface tranquility. Street lamps cast gentle pools of light. The tabby patrolled the rooftops and the residents withdrew indoors, whispering conjectures to themselves and one another. Purbright walked slowly along the cobbles, observing the quiet interplay of shadows, movements, and the faint tension that lingered in the air. He reflected that in Chatterley Lane, the extraordinary often masqueraded as ordinary, and the most revealing evidence came not from overt actions, but from the delicate choreography of attention, hesitation, and gesture. The intruder, he understood, had mastered this subtle theatre, leaving behind a trail of minor disruptions that, collectively, were steadily exposing character, intent, and perhaps the underlying motive behind these careful provocations. By the time he departed for the evening, Purbright was certain that patience, careful observation, and an appreciation of the subtleties of human behavior would in due course illuminate the identity of the unseen hand manipulating the lane's daily life. In the quiet persistence of anomalies, he recognized the first outlines of understanding, though the full picture remained tantalizingly out of reach. The morning air in Chatterley Lane carried a quiet anticipation, as though the cobbles themselves were aware that the week's subtle disturbances were approaching a turning point. Inspector Purbright walked at his usual measured pace, noting the lane's familiar rhythms now tinged with the faint edge of unease. Residents moved with careful deliberation, exchanging brief nods and guarded smiles, their behavior more revealing in its restraint than any overt gesture could have been. Purbright's first stop was Finch's shop, where the counter bore the now familiar signs of interference. Finch, fussing with a small stack of letters, spoke with restrained anxiety.
"Inspector, I noticed something odd. My letter rack was slightly rotated."
It may seem trivial, but it struck me as deliberate. Purbright examined the rack, observing the minute shift and the faint fingerprint smudge along its edge. The intruder's pattern was becoming clearer, deliberate, precise, yet designed to be interpreted rather than directly incriminating. Small acts, he reflected, often spoke volumes when watched attentively. He proceeded along the lane, quietly questioning residents. Mrs. Weatherby mentioned noticing a man lingering near the corner shop at an unusual hour, pausing to glance down the lane before walking away. Mr. Tilling added that the shadow of someone had been observed flitting across his doorway, measured in pace and direction. Miss Blenkinsop, ever meticulous, had recorded subtle discrepancies in the placement of outdoor ornaments and the timing of passerby movements. Returning briefly to Finch's, Purbright noted an unexpected addition, a small scrap of fabric caught on the handle of the display case. It was delicate, patterned, and clearly displaced as if inadvertently left behind during careful manipulation. The inspector pocketed it, recognizing that such a detail, trivial in appearance, often carried critical significance. Mid-afternoon brought the second incident, a minor theft at the local grocer's. Mrs. Crabtree discovered that a small cash tin, left momentarily on a back shelf,
had been shifted, though nothing was missing.
The act, though faintly audacious, mirrored the previous intrusions, subtle, teasing, and intended to provoke observation rather than gain material advantage. Purbright noted the timing and method with interest, recognizing the same hand at work. He walked the lane, observing reactions. The residents, though outwardly composed, betrayed tiny signs of disturbance. A glance held too long, a hand tightening on a gate, a slight hesitation in speech. These behaviors were far more instructive than any direct statement, offering insight into the intruder's impact on the collective psychology of the lane. By evening, Purbright returned to the shop, aligning the sequence of anomalies: the envelope, the teaspoon, the key, the brooch, the letter rack, the scrap of fabric, and the moved cash tin. Each had occurred with precision and subtlety, creating a web of minor disruptions designed to elicit attention, test perception, and reveal responses. He reflected that the intruder's intent was not theft alone, but a careful study of human behavior under the constraints of civility and routine. The lane settled into the usual evening rhythm, yet the tension persisted, a quiet residue of the day's disturbances. Shadows lengthened under the lamps, and the tabby prowled with measured disdain. Purbright walked slowly, considering the accumulation of evidence, the behavior of residents, and the small, deliberate anomalies that had escalated with uncanny consistency. He understood that the intruder's careful pattern was nearing its climax, that the subtle provocations were intended to draw attention, elicit reaction, and perhaps provoke confession through observation rather than force. In Chatterley Lane, he reflected, the smallest acts often carried the largest weight, and he was content to let the lane itself reveal the final threads of the puzzle before taking the decisive step toward resolution. The morning arrived with a subdued light that softened the angles of Chatterley Lane, yet did nothing to diminish the tension that had been building over the past week. Inspector Purbright moved at his customary deliberate pace, noting the familiar domestic rhythms now tinged with a faint, almost imperceptible edge of anxiety. Residents appeared outwardly composed, but their gestures and glances betrayed an underlying awareness of the unusual events that had unfolded. The envelope, the teaspoon, the key, the brooch, the displaced letter rack, the scrap of fabric, and the shifted cash tin. Purbright began his day with Finch's shop, where the shopkeeper fussed over the display cases with a nervous precision.
"Inspector," he said, his voice low, "another small item is missing, my silver thimble."
"I am certain I placed it on the counter this morning." Purbright examined the counter carefully, noting the faint indentation where the thimble had rested. The pattern of intrusions was now unmistakable, deliberate, subtle, and designed to provoke careful observation. Each minor disruption, seemingly trivial in isolation, collectively suggested a hand that was testing both objects and human reactions. He proceeded along the lane, speaking quietly with residents who observed from windows or doorways. Mrs. Weatherby mentioned a fleeting shadow at the corner of the shop, moving with an economy of motion that suggested experience and caution. Mr. Tilling noted a figure loitering near his signpost. Its pauses measured, its attention selective. Miss Blenkinsop, ever meticulous, recorded the arrival and departure of pedestrians, their glances and hesitations noted in precise detail. Mid-morning brought a subtle but deliberate provocation. A note slipped under Finch's door, bearing the phrase, "Curiosity often betrays." Purbright read it, noting the handwriting and pressure of the pen. It was neither threatening nor accusatory, yet it implied awareness, intelligence, and intent. The intruder was clearly observing the lane, testing responses, and perhaps inviting engagement without force. By early afternoon, Purbright visited the grocer, Mrs. Crabtree, who mentioned seeing the man in tweed again, standing momentarily at the lane's edge before moving away silently. The pattern of repeated, carefully measured observation reinforced the notion of deliberate testing. Small disturbances followed by watchful attention, intended to draw notice without revealing motive. Returning to Finch's, Purbright examined all accumulated anomalies: the envelope, the teaspoon, the key, the brooch, the letter rack, the scrap of fabric, the shifted cash tin, the thimble, and now the cryptic note. Each was a minor act, yet collectively they formed a coherent sequence of provocation, observation, and subtle communication. The intruder's intent was unmistakable: to study human behavior, provoke responses, and leave traces that invited scrutiny without revealing the full purpose. As evening approached, the lane resumed its ordinary rhythm. Street lamps cast gentle pools of light, the tabby patrolled the rooftops, and the residents withdrew indoors, whispering conjectures to themselves and one another. Purbright walked slowly along the cobbles, reflecting on the cumulative effect of the intrusions. The lane's subtle disruption, he knew, had reached a critical point. The intruder's pattern was complete, the provocations sufficient, and the moment for careful intervention near at hand. Patience, observation, and the quiet assessment of human nature had brought him to the verge of understanding. In Chatterley Lane, he reflected, even the smallest gestures carried immense significance, and the orchestration of minor acts had now revealed enough for him to prepare the polite but deliberate measures that would draw the final truth into view. The resolution, he knew, would be as understated and precise as the intrusions themselves, resting upon observation, inference, and the subtle pressure of circumstance rather than overt confrontation. The morning air in Chatterley Lane carried a crisp clarity that seemed to magnify every shadow,
every movement and every whisper among the residents.
Inspector Purbright moved with his accustomed measured pace, noting the subtle, almost imperceptible tension that now dominated the street. The week's series of anomalies, the envelope, the teaspoon, the key, the brooch, the letter rack, the scrap of fabric, the shifted cash tin, the thimble, and the cryptic note, had reached a quiet crescendo. Each act, seemingly trivial, had served its purpose, drawing observation, testing patience, and revealing character. Purbright paused outside Finch's shop, observing the shopkeeper adjusting the display cases with nervous care.
"Inspector," Finch said, I do not understand.
"Everything seems ordinary now, yet I feel that nothing is as it should be." Purbright inclined his head. "That perception, Mr. Finch, is often the result of careful orchestration. The extraordinary frequently disguises itself as the trivial in small towns." Inside the shop, he surveyed the cumulative anomalies once more. The displaced items, the faint smudges, and the notes all formed a pattern of deliberate intervention. He considered each resident's reactions, the heightened attention, the measured glances, the whispered conjectures. The intruder had been meticulous, almost playful, manipulating perception and observing the consequences. He summoned Finch and a small group of residents into the shop, arranging them so that each could be observed in turn. Polite conversation ensued, seemingly trivial remarks about the weather, the display, and daily life. Yet Purbright's questions, carefully phrased, were designed to elicit more than they seemed to seek. A pause, a slight hesitation from Finch, a quick glance exchanged between Mrs. Weatherby and Miss Blenkinsop. The inspector noted these gestures with quiet precision, letting silence and observation do the work of accusation. Finally, he addressed the assembled residents, his tone calm, civil, and deliberately unhurried. The series of disturbances in this lane, the envelope, the teaspoon, the key, the brooch, the letter rack, the scrap of fabric, the cash tin, the thimble, and the note, were not the result of carelessness or random mischief. They were the work of one among you seeking to observe how easily a small disruption might provoke attention and reveal human behavior under subtle pressure. He let the words settle, Eyes widened, breaths caught, and the silence thickened. Then, as if prompted by the careful arrangement of attention, a single figure, Miss Blenkinsop, hesitated and then admitted in quiet tones, "It was me, Inspector."
I wanted to see.
To understand. "I did not mean harm," Purbright acknowledged her statement with the faintest nod. Indeed, the intention was not malice but curiosity, applied with meticulous care. Each act was designed to test perception and patience, and the Lane responded as expected, attentively, nervously, and with subtle deviations from routine, he continued, calmly explaining how each anomaly had been deliberately orchestrated and how the minor traces, the faint smudges, the shifted objects, the cryptic notes were intended as prompts for observation. He described how the reactions of the residents had, in turn, revealed character, instinct, and social habits, all without confrontation or coercion. By late afternoon, the lane had settled into its familiar rhythm. The tabby prowled its customary rooflines, the soft glow of lamps cast gentle shadows, and the residents resumed daily routines with a quiet acknowledgement of what had transpired. Finch, relieved and bemused, rearranged his display with meticulous care, while Miss Blenkinsop reflected on the lessons learned from her carefully conducted experiment. Purbright walked the lane once more, absorbing the calm and the small, lingering adjustments in behaviour. In Chatterley Lane, he reflected, the extraordinary often passed unnoticed in the guise of the trivial, and the subtle orchestration of observation had revealed more than any overt action ever could. With patience, perception, and quiet reflection, the pattern had been discerned, and order restored without disturbance, leaving the residents wiser and more aware of both themselves and one another. He returned to Finch's shop, settled into his chair, and allowed the day's observations to dissolve into quiet paperwork, content that in the unassuming lanes of a small town, human nature had been gently illuminated through subtlety, civility, and careful attention.